State. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies were stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Myths Podcast. Welcome to the Black Myths Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right, so this is the first episode of a three-part series we're doing on the Klan. It's going to be likely a different myth with each one, but it's a three-part series because there are three waves of the Klan. So today the myth is very simple. Is that the Klan or the KKK began in Indiana. This is actually, just if you're dealing with it on a factual level, a pretty easy one to debunk. You can Google this right now. You'll find that it did not start in Indiana. The first wave of the Klan didn't even have a chapter in Indiana. It was, and we'll get to that more in the episode. Don't want to give away everything too quickly, but so we're gonna do that, and it's gonna be mixture of us on the three of these. This one, all three of them, you're gonna have Rasul Mowatt, who I'm sure anyone who continually listens to this show is aware of who that is. That is my co-author for Laundering Black Rage. That is also just my partner in scholarship in general. And he is a professor at North Carolina State, and his work is deeply, honestly, it's one of the first ways I met him was his work in lynching and his work in his doing historical research of white supremacist groups and such. So gonna get to it pretty quickly here. I just want to knock out a few things. Shout out to the patrons. I know we've not done the greatest job this year of keeping that really exclusive for y'all, so I appreciate everybody that's continued to go with it. This episode, though, there will be bonus content for those who are on Patreon. I will upload that soon. And we're going to try to do that and also just incorporate some new things. I know I've said this before, and then I'll do it, and then I get, mixed up. So, but this is something I am going to attempt to take more seriously. So, but thank you for those who continue to contribute despite us not being as consistent as we could be on that. So thank you to those. Thank you to SD. It looks like was the last one to sign up. And even those who cancel, we appreciate as well. But thanks to everybody that keeps us going, nonetheless. Do want to give a few comments and read a monologue for this myth. Because I originally didn't have one, but I wanted to give something to frame it, just so people didn't take this as just a literal fact kind of myth. Like, it did start here, it started there, because, we like to give context with our myths. We're not here to just be like fact checkers and annoying kind of HR types, right? So we'll read this monologue, and then it's just going to transition right into the conversation and discussion interview that I had with Rasul Mowatt. And again, we're going to start with the first Klan. We'll explain what all that means in terms of three waves of the Klan, and all of that will be explained. So if you don't know much about the Klan other than just they wore goofy ass suits and they were racist, that's totally fine. But considering the era that we're in, we found this relevant topic to study. So I'm gonna read this and then we're gonna get to it. One may ask, why does this myth even matter? If the Klan is a Klan, who really cares where it started? They will lynch you in Indiana just like they'll lynch you in Tennessee. People say this, and this is a fairly valid response, because if the Klan was flogging me with the whip, as the first wave of the Klan was known to do, I wouldn't particularly care whether this fascist organization started in Indiana or Tennessee. It really wouldn't matter. My only goal would be to escape the reach of their terror. However, if my goal was to defeat the Klan and white supremacy in general, I would want to know the history of my enemy to understand what I am facing. Growing up in Indiana, the Klan was always present in some way. Confederate flags waved across the front lawns in my hometown. a former high school called itself the Southside Rebels, where they once used the Confederate flag as their school flag. Once upon a time, when my brother was in elementary school, he was supposed to go on a field trip to a nearby city to watch a Civil War reenactment, which would have been in favor of the Union. But our mom told us it was canceled because there was a Klan rally instead, so he was not able to go to this Civil War reenactment. And like, a Klan rally is not the best field trip for a young black kid. So obviously, many of us thought because of these kind of occurrences that the KKK started here. As I grew older and began to travel, I learned many people outside of the state believed the Klan started here too. Someone would curiously ask me when I was out and about, like, where are you from? And I'd say I'm from Indiana. And they'd be like, ain't that where the Klan started? Granted, at one point during the 1920s, up to a third of the state of Indiana's native-born white Protestant men signed up for the Klan. Up to a whole third, y'all. So I understand why people get the impression that, this is where it started. Nevertheless, for years, I never knew what the Klan stood for, besides the typical liberal accusations of hate and bigotry, particularly those against black people. This logic extended to white supremacy more broadly. I was never taught to understand the strategies and tactics of white supremacists, the differences that existed among them, or what their real goals were. Instead, most of us just laughed them off as racist buffoons from the past or idiots who were still holding on to the past. This logic is dangerous, though, because it fails to understand white supremacy and it fails to take it seriously. It's part of why we are in the situation we are in today. People treat debating a white supremacist as engaging in democracy, or it's just their opinion. It's just a matter of free speech. No wonder some of these folks get statues and days of remembrance. Liberals tell us it's just ignorance, that this can be fixed by reading a book in a DEI workshop or acknowledging their one's white privilege. White leftists tell us that they're quote unquote acting against their own interests, as if white supremacy is not its own form of interest. Meanwhile, the Klan consolidates with Nazis. And if you even read, and just recently in the New York Times, reportedly the Proud Boys are so comfortable that they don't even feel like they need to protest anymore. So comfortable with the current administration. So many of us don't understand our enemy or have quietly joined them. So no, the Klan didn't start in Indiana. Saying it did usually follows the same innocent ignorance I just described. This sentiment, though, helps us understand nothing of what we face. Yet, Black Myths is always interested in getting to the bottom of what we're up against. As Malcolm X taught us, of all our studies, history is the best qualified to reward our research. So let's get into the research.
Yeah, I mean, I know, you're born and raised in Indiana, so there's one sense that, a lot of people in Indiana could have a perception of that sort of myth of the
Mhm.
origin of the Klan, but no, it's outside of Indiana as well. So, I know before I ever moved there when I was at another academic institution there, I always had that perception as well. If I drove through it, I would sort of be a little more cautious of my
Mhm.
speed and stuff like that and that type of thing because that was what was said, and that was what was understood, and I could swear up and down that, the Klan had a date in which it started in some town or city in Indiana. And then when I finally moved there, then I know we'll get into that either in the second or, third episode. But, then there's a specific sort of location in Indiana that's then mentioned, right? Um, so that's there. And I mean, there is a need to clear that up. But the reason why is a need to clear that up is because it reduces the Klan to, some specific sort of context, uh, a state with not a lot of major cities, probably rural, an idea and so forth, and not
Rednecks
yeah,
or
exactly.
farmer white boys.
Yeah.
You get to that doesn't really happen to the third wave.
And so then it becomes something to comfort us so that, well, all I gotta do is just never move there, right? Or I can just
Mhm.
avoid my time, in Indiana, let me hurry up and get through the state. If I'm going to Detroit, let me hurry up and drive, through as many sort of cities as fast as possible, or be cautious while I'm doing that. And so all as if like it's safer in Ohio, or Pennsylvania or whatever else.
Right.
Like, what I mean, as soon, it's like you can breathe now once you, get past the border. Now you can stop,
Right. Right.
now you can stop at that truck stop to use the bathroom because you didn't want to stop and use the bathroom. I mean, this was real. I mean, this was real, and I'm sure it's still real for a lot of people. This is what they probably do with the state. And yeah, exactly. It does sound like we're trying to, protect the dignity of the state, but no, it's just about, being accurate because in that accuracy, it sort of allows us to sort of see the full expanse of the Klan, but then also what else was happening besides the Klan. So, I mean, with my specific work, I started with looking at lynching. And for me, even though I think I had certain, sort of professors who tried to push me back in the day with, talking about, how I, felt when I looked at the images of lynching or how did other people feel when they look at the images of lynching, I was like, that's a known. Like, I already know, what most people should sort of react to by looking at images of lynching. I haven't run into anybody who looks at a lynching photograph and is like, yeah, they deserve it. I mean, just have not, period.
Right.
Right. Um, but for me, it was just like, no, I need to understand. If I need to understand lynching, I need to understand the perpetrators of the lynching.
Mhm.
Maybe also the spectators, but definitely the perpetrators. Like, why would you do this? Why would you do this? And also in this way, right? And so by researching, perpetrator violence of lynching, then you go through either myths of who did lynchings and who didn't do lynchings, where did they do them. So that's kind of the progression. The lynching research led to a greater sort of understanding of violence, and then looking at white nationalism and white separatism. And so, I know maybe we can get into that, like why in particular I also use those two distinctive terms as opposed to like white supremacy as an example, right?
Mhm.
Um, that led to then it branched off to also looking at that and then also looking at, like I said, where did lynchings happen? So why did the town square or the center of downtown was used? And so then that kind of led to research on cities. And so, the work has expanded to policing and prisons and, in the sort of more contemporary and then in the past, looking at like colonialism, colonial histories. Yeah, the lynching is the thing that sort of moved me in these particular directions. And so I'm not a Klan researcher per se. I'm definitely a lynching researcher, and just that the Klan definitely has some sort of connection to lynching, even
Right.
though they're not exclusively, they're not the creators of lynching. They're not, always engaged in lynching. They're engaged in killing, but maybe not lynching, Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it seems like it seems like even from preparing for the show, they probably did the most lynching in this wave,
It- yeah.
way more than the other two
Yeah.
waves.
Yeah. Yeah.
But from what I read, like they did, like the stuff that just there was. I mean, it was some. I don't really talk. I mean, I don't. It's not that important about like the stuff we have to read and like the emotions of it. But it was some gruesome stuff to swallow when you got
Yeah.
to read, especially this wave because this was a very violent wave. And I guess to that point, we keep throwing around the term wave. Just
Mhm.
very briefly, can you explain when we say these three waves of the Klan, like what that means, what the just kind of I know the dates aren't quite the same, like the dates can kind of vary, but generally, what were the dates? But more so, like, what do we mean when we say the wave of the
Yeah.
Klan? Because in academia, waves gets thrown around for a lot of stuff.
Right.
The
Right.
average person probably doesn't even know what that like. What do we mean when we say the wave? Like this is
Yeah.
the first wave, second wave, third wave. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And the three ways of the Klan really was something that I was introduced to while at Indiana University because of two historians really were, mentioning that in the sort of moments that I had, in terms of interaction with them, Claude Clegg and James Madison. They both sort of mentioned it, and it was from there that I sort of started to look into like, oh man, I never thought that there was either different periods or that the Klan wasn't just one long continuous.
Hate group.
Yeah, exactly. And so they did not create the waves, and I don't know who. Like, in most books that actually use the term, there's no citation in relationship
I
to.
haven't seen it either.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. So unfortunately, there's this person who's created, this understanding that has been, that's been useful for historians and sociologists and criminal justice researchers for quite some time, probably in the past 10, 15 years, that at least I can tell that there is a sort of understanding that there is this sort of distinctive periods, three waves, three phases. And so the first Klan is, again, what we're going to focus in on today, and it starts right after the Civil War. And it ends not too soon after that, which is also surprising, where it does not survive past, the middle of the next decade. So it's not a thing that really lasts for a long time. So that's the first Klan. And then the second Klan, comes about associated with the time period of World War One, but specifically when a particular movie, The Birth of a Nation, comes out, and The Birth of a Nation highlights the Klan, and we'll talk about the movie, I'm sure, in the next episode. But that's initiates the second Klan because there's now this revival. The movie inspires people, and movies do inspire, just like they inspire now. People have enlisted in the army based upon a movie. People have
Gun.
yeah, people have walked around greeting each other with the X symbol after watching that movie that neither one of us cares to ever talk about, with the character that dressed all in black with that's a cat. And so 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 I mean, like so it's no different, back then as it is now. So people saw the movie and was like, we need to bring this back. And so that's the second Klan period, and the second Klan ends, and that's the probably the strongest longest period. And so it sort of ends like mid 20s, even though it kind of lingers to like the 30s, but it
I've
does.
seen some numbers as high as like the early 40s.
Yeah,
Like, but that's what I was saying. These aren't definitive dates. Like, it kind
right,
of depends
right.
on which you could read two different encyclopedias and they'll have a different year.
Right. Yeah. And and this is not us sort of saying that there weren't people who still had their hoods in their attic and so on, but where there's no way to chart that as a continuation. Like just because this member or former member holds on to their memorabilia, their wardrobe, doesn't mean that the Klan still is like having formal meetings, having dues, having an agenda, giving members tasks and responsibilities, and having chapters. And so, so the
Yeah, they
second
might
client.
go underground.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
that's why, with even with my work with like prisons, they might show up in these more underground places like a prison or, you know,
Right. Yeah.
but which kind of goes to that invisible empire thing, but they're not an active. I think when we say waves, is the wave, the word or the term wave, I think is important. Like in terms of it being a rush where this is happening in multiple states
Right.
inside all different counties within that state, and they are assuming power. They're not just marching or there's not just random killings. Like they are either challenging power or assuming power to some extent. That's I think important too. And they had different motivations, political motivations each wave.
Yeah. And also driving it is that there is a national organization. So there is a national organization then that's doing the exact thing that you just mentioned. So then the third Klan is roughly mid 50s, and it sort of dies out at the end of the 70s or early 80s, and that's the three clans. And so I know some people may be talking about them, what about in the, thing, present
About
day?
Trump.
Yeah, and all that type of stuff. And so people have been less inclined to call a fourth clan because one, we're living in the period, and two, there's not a sort of coherent, national leadership, national directive. There may be people who, wear the items, invoke the symbolism, say that they are associated, with the organization, but that does not mean that they truly represent it fully. I mean, we have plenty of examples of that in other sort of contexts where people just appropriate the name, appropriate the history because they know they can get membership in that way because it's a sort of understood and known thing. So those are the three clans. So again, for listeners, the first clan is directly after Civil War, ends mid 1870s. The second clan is roughly 1915 to the mid to late 1920s, and then the third clan is mid to late 1950s up to the end of the 1970s or early 1980s.
Right. No, thanks for that. And one more distinction before we get into the history. You talked about white nationalism and white separatism.
Yeah.
What's the distinction and why would that be important for this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess stepping out a little bit more, deeper understanding of white supremacy. I think most people think of white supremacy as almost just another way to say racism, and you
Hate.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so then to me, that lack of distinction reduces both racism and white supremacy, and so um, we understand still Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of, racism being premature death, then racism is that work of death, either slow or fast. And so that does not require white supremacy. That doesn't have to even be associated with white. It's anywhere where there is a dominant group, that has then racialized another particular group, and is now sort of working them to death, giving them poor quality living, and so forth. But it also gives the impression that white supremacy is like an attitude as opposed to, an ideology, as if, right, hate, like, and so the way to combat hate is love, right? And so we paint on the side of our cheeks, no hate, and the more we do that, it sort of, upsets, those people. Or, we try to defeat the Klan by going after individual members and trying to get them to convert out of it, and you know
Or
that
even, yeah, or just generally, even with white supremacy, especially this last, I'm using the word wave very loosely, but this like anti-racist, liberal anti-racist wave where the idea is you can like, teach people to check their biases,
yeah, yeah,
white supremacy out of their heart, like it's deep in their subconscious somewhere,
right.
like that kind of thing. I have more to say on that, but finish the distinction.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and and we also think of, like, apologies to Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks comes up with that term, white supremacist.
Capitalist patriarchy,
Yeah,
white
yeah, yeah.
supremacy, capitalist patriarchy.
Yeah, I think in certain contexts that sort of phrase, has a meaning, but it also flattens it. I mean, I think she understood what those words mean, and that's why she is actually employing it. But I think we don't, and so we just sort of requote her without understanding their distinction, right? And so we almost think of it as, oh, those three things are gender, race, and class, and so. But no, the history of the Klan involves progressivism, during the second Klan. There's feminist aspects of the Klan during parts of it. They're one of the earliest organizations that had, women leadership. And if we think of the fourth Klan, the quote unquote fourth Klan, the unofficial fourth Klan, then it's been both feminist as well as queer representation in the Klan. And so patriarchy is, for me, then it sort of breaks out that patriarchy is more like an ideology of property control. Capitalism is more of a ideology of property wealth. And so then white supremacy is this ideology of property ownership, right? So there's these sort of there's a relationship between the three, but the relationship is not that there is a sort of race, class, and gender. It is different facets of property, right? Control.
It's not an attitude necessarily.
Yeah, so there's a relationship all between the three, and so then the ideology of white supremacy has to be enacted. That otherwise it makes no sense because it's not just white people are superior. That makes then that's just people walking around with their chest out, and just acting proud.
Which really, if that's all it was, in some cases, it isn't even going to be very harmful. If it's just people
Yeah,
walking around in their heads thinking that they're better than people,
yeah.
it has to be acted out.
Yeah, but no, I mean, it's clear that, with some of the earliest, forms of ideology that even predate the Klan, Aryan ideology, nativism, eugenics, these things, concern themselves with specific articulations of what white supremacy is for them and then how to do it. And so in the case of white nationalists, they are pursuing, the creation of a sort of cleaner, pure white nation. And there's disagreements, between those people who have, who see white nationalism. Some have no problem with having the racial other present, but they just need to be in an inferior position, you
Right.
know. And then you have the white separatists who are like, we need to separate. We do not. Then there
We don't
needs
even want to be associated with
exactly.
whatever.
And
Yeah, yeah.
right. And so white nationalists, may see themselves as either taking control of like the United States or and or replacing it, whereas white separatists would be more so pursuing an escape from it, and isolating themselves from it. I think we have some examples of some attempts in the present day where you have these sort of enclaves that are forming in certain states that are white only, and that would be an example of white separatism to some degree, but not as strongly because I haven't heard really good, clear ideology from them. They're just sort of enacting it based upon just I guess what they think, and probably from watching videos, right? Like, what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I don't think that it's that deep. I don't think that they're that steep in the literature of white power.
Right. So no, that's helpful because I think that's probably true with all nationalisms to some extent. Obviously, I'm not. This is not to say all nationalisms are the same or nearly as bad as white nationalism, but in the sense that some nationalists do think you can, achieve a level of sovereignty within a structure, and then others are, then other people are like, yo, we're not even gonna mess with this. Like, we want our own land
Yeah,
separate of,
yeah,
and our own sovereignty separate of whatever we currently are under. Um, and I think that's where those distinctions matter because then different tactics emerge based upon those motivations and upon those goals. And I think today, I mean, I will talk about later in this series about since a lot of these groups came together, I think that's why you see a lot of, like hodgepodge inconsistencies
hmm
because
right,
some of these ideas don't really mix,
right, yeah,
even if
yeah,
they're all white and they hate something, that they actually don't still ideologically always mix. And that's why there's these inconsistencies. And, even when we talk about the Trump administration and people trying to come up with all these different theories on it, like we talked about in one interview we had, like it's just there's a lot of different converting or converging interests around the administration. Some are white nationalists, of course, but I'm just saying, like, you that's why you get a very inconsistent, incoherent administration because like
Yeah,
because they're
yeah,
trying to please all these different factions that they've been able to unite to take power. But they're not there's some real issues in terms of how power should be, wielded, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's a challenge I think that you can even say with the Klan, even internal to the Klan is faced in terms of how power should be wielded. Because even preparing for this episode, sometime leadership will come out and say, we're just a self-defense organization, right? We
mhm,
condone, just attacking people randomly, even if some of that was just for cover, and then in some cases, leadership didn't want to go too far, like, because this wasn't the most organized wave of the Klan. So there's also that.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, and I mean, I think we're also learning the lesson of, ethno states are not good.
yeah.
And so, and so white nationalism, and I think that's kind of also what you're getting at is that all nationalisms, if they have a component of a racial identity as the focus, um, are problematic. Maybe some, white nationalism is problematic right at the beginning, because of what they're willing to do to create that from the onset, and some, nationalisms that are racially sort of, specific may have some issues, along the way. Um, but ethno states are likely not a good thing, both for clearly whatever other population that's present, but also for the people who are of the sort of identified ethnic group. Because now all of a sudden you have to maintain a particular purity and function and so forth. I think about in some other work, when Mobutu takes over the Congo, and during the era of that documentary When We Were Kings with Muhammad Ali, going to fight George Foreman, he had instituted this widespread policy of requiring Congolese to wear traditional garb,
Yeah.
like forcibly wear traditional garb. There was this whole group of
They
people.
renamed that. What was it? Zaire.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. So they named it in that way. There was this group of people who, used to like to dress sharp and listen to jazz music called sappeurs, and they were killed. I mean, they would be brought out into the stadium and gunned down if, and so they politically resisted by continuing to wear their suits and, their hats and, stylish shoes and so forth, and they were gunned down. And so then the remaining, sappeurs, went underground, and they buried their clothes in like chests and dug it, in their backyard, so the chest couldn't even be found. And so that was an example of an ethno state trying to, be formed in the Congo, becoming Zaire, and demanding then all these different ethnic groups to then become this one ethnic group. And if you didn't adhere to it, goodbye.
yeah. Yeah. I think even with some of the struggles of, again, we're not equating like black nationalism with white nationalism. The
Yeah.
history is pretty clear on the differences there. But even with some of the struggles with black nationalism, you even in the United States, you see some of these challenges where people try to make black a very specific thing. You're
Mhm.
seeing this today with all these silly diaspora wars, right?
Yeah. Right.
But to not get into that, but but more so to connect to show that when you try to like force feed this very specific identity, the group can also turn on itself, right? Like then as we'll see with the Klan will turn on
Yeah.
itself or turn on
Yeah.
even other white people
Yeah.
that will lead to its downfall. Because you're attempting to force feed, this very specific identity on the folks. And then also, in the case of Israel, you can create a delusional diaspora, that buys into this origin story, so much so that genocide becomes something that they can rationalize, right? Like like so this is cap this any group is capable of this though. Like this is not a DNA thing. This is
Absolutely.
not this
Great
is
point.
not and to play it that way is to talk about it that way like it is some kind of like something specific to the body or the mind or something like
Mhm.
that actually is perpetuates this kind of, like you were talking about eugenicist approach to things anyway. Like there's something, that's just about a certain kind of people that isn't based on anything material. It's just something, that's just innate. It's pathological, right? Now you can say a idea has a certain pathology or the way that an ideology works has a, like I think white supremacy has a lot of bad pathologies to it, but those are that's the ideology, not necessarily just human beings are inherently going to go this way or that way.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think this segues right into the war,
yeah,
right? So war becomes very easy to wage when you've racialized the other. And racialize the other doesn't mean that you just have political cartoons that, that make caricatures out of the other people. But it's just that you have narratives that set up that these people are not you, right?
yeah,
And so war becomes a very sort of easy thing in that way because if they're similar, it's very difficult to generate a support for war, to draft troops, to garner resources. And so I know some of the things that we'll touch on, or maybe right now touch on, is sort of like the importance of war as it relates to white supremacist groups that are enacting white nationalism or white separatism.
well, yeah, so that does segue in good because another thing the research will show, and we can just get into the history and this dealing with this first wave, but there is this correlation of war and the uptick of explicit white supremacist groups and activity, which is going to be a common theme throughout all this, throughout each episode. But could you explain what is that correlation and more specifics so we can get into this episode and related to the Civil War, but how that also is something we're going to find even in the second wave, third wave, like why is there an uptick? I think in the Civil War context, it's a little easier to identify because the
Right.
South was destroyed, so they didn't really have
Yeah.
a state. But so somebody was gonna have to fill that vacuum. But why is that? Like, why is there a correlation with these waves of activity and war?
Yeah, I think, recognizing the work of, Kathleen Belew in her book, Bring the War Home, that's who really studied and found there's a relationship between wartime and the formation or expansion of white supremacist based, organizations, or what she says, and I agree with, the modern white power movement. So she really only looks at the emergence of like the Klan and other groups after the Vietnam War, and she sees that after each war, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, you know, there is this sort of all of a sudden increase, and some of that is, these people are receiving training.
Yeah, yeah,
The training itself may steer somebody in a particular way, or they're being sent to intentionally go into the armed forces to get training and also access, because there's been plenty of cases of theft of weaponry on trucks that have been supposed to be moving from one fort to another. In some cases, they've found the plot of certain white nationalist-based groups trying to get a mass group of arms.
right.
So that's all her work, and but so there's that connection to this war energy that can't go anywhere, especially with the type of wars that happen now, where it's not like massive infantry lines. It's people behind desks, in particular vehicles on bases a lot, monitoring situations and things like that. But one of the things that she mentions is that there is a greater sense of government betrayal, a perception of government betrayal.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, well, I guess that's a slip of a tongue, so, but there's a perception of government betrayal, and there's also time periods of changes in the racial social order, right? That happens around these particular time periods, right? Where, Vietnam, this is an entire area where a lot of black populations in particular were no longer only sort of regulated in large numbers in clerical, custodial, industry, factory related jobs. They were now, within particular office spaces, academia, and so forth. And so people come back and they see this new racial order and they flip out. Um,
Yeah,
and
white
so
collar jobs. Yeah.
and so then there's this ideology that forms, and that's kind of the basis of her argument. So for me, though, I argue that I think that her theory holds up if you extend it backwards, right? So if you, then go to the Korean War, there's a slow birth of the second Klan, during the Korean War. World War II, there's some calm that happens with the GI Bill, but there's also some reaction, at the later phases of the things that come out of post World
You
War
said
II.
Korean War, you mean the slow birth of the third clan?
Yeah, no, the slow sort of like crumbling, my bad, not
Oh, I thought you meant
crumbling of,
reverse,
yeah, 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 yeah,
like
yeah,
reemergence. Okay, okay,
yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So you
and
mean it in reverse, like that kind of is a more of a demise, right?
right, yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay, I
right,
got you.
and then World War II, the GI Bill, post World War II, you have this sort of, expansion of, benefit opportunities. Immediately, of course, black populations aren't necessarily benefiting from that, but eventually they do. And there's this sort of widespread reaction to, why is this family moving into our neighborhood,
Hmm.
and so then also there's World War One with, the Second Klan, and the Red Scare. Um,
And
during the Spanish American War, there's a bunch of race riots, that are happening also around the same time period. But the Spanish American War is specifically in 1898, and that's
yeah,
the same year as the Wilmington, race riot, right?
yeah,
And then, the Civil War, which is what we're focusing on today. Post it, you have the, sort of the emergence of the first Klan, but then also other groups, and so I think her argument holds up. She just doesn't make that argument because she didn't look at that. She didn't look at those materials. I'm assuming probably in a future book she may, go backwards and confirm that particular point.
nah, yeah. And it, so in the case of the Civil War, um, what are some of the conditions we're looking at?
Yeah,
So when we're
yeah,
talking about the Klan, just to kind of frame this for people, there's people call it also, I don't think we've said it yet, like vigilantes. And
yeah.
I think I pulled a definition because I think we're not talking about Batman here or or anything like
But we
that.
are, and also,
Yeah, yeah.
it's
Like
what.
I mean, to some extent, Um, but like I just wanna I thought I had it, but it's not up. Um, a member of a self-appointed group of citizens who undertake law enforcement in their community without legal authority, typically because the legal agencies are thought to be inadequate. Now, inadequate is inadequate to their cause, right? Because you could say the Union was adequate for some things and not adequate for others. So you have this war in which the South just lost, the Confederacy lost.
Hmm.
And to
Hmm.
your point, you have these guys who have been at war, involved in a lot of guerrilla type tactics anyway, because they were the weaker army in terms of just industrial capacity and like things of that nature. So and they've lost and they don't feel, again, none of us is sympathizing, but we're trying to understand what you're up against here. So if y'all keep hearing us try to explain their context, it's because we're actually studying the Klan itself, not their victims necessarily. So they don't feel like they're being properly represented. They feel like there's an occupying power from the
Yeah, yeah,
North. That's their perspective. I was just
yeah.
rewatching House of Cards randomly just to fall asleep, and Frank, one of the only good things he says on the show is they call the he says something about slavery was a not dumb thing to fight for, blah blah. But he talks about how, remember he was from Gaffney, South Carolina in that show, and he talks about how the in the South they viewed the North as this like occupying power. This these Yankees up north, you still hear this, right?
Right.
And you even hear these dog whistles sometimes when they say the East Coast and all that kind of shit, right? Like in Middle America, like all that. Um, so they feel like there's these troops who are occupying them and are taking their land and taking their way of life. And they have all these skills nonetheless, right? So I guess the question is I guess I kind of answered this question, like what makes vigilante a method of choice? Like what, is, why does vigilantism like emerge as a response to that, even if I probably to some extent already answered it, but what are some of the other factors, I guess, that gives that rise?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so one, which I think most people don't know with Reconstruction, that there were military districts over the South. So, it's not just like the Civil War ended. There was Gettysburg where they signed it, and then there's just somehow like some rebuilding, right? Some people go to jail for a little bit of time. Some people go to jail for a long period of time. Like, no, this was a group of states that, remember, succeeded from the United States,
Yeah.
and you can't just automatically just bring them back in, because they still are what they made themselves. And so the entire South is put under military control, and there's 5 districts. District 1 was primarily in present-day Virginia, with the headquarters in Richmond, overseen by a U.S. Army general. District 2 was North Carolina, South Carolina, headquarters in Charleston. District 3 is in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, with headquarters in Atlanta. District 4 was in Mississippi and Arkansas, with headquarters in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And then District 5 was Louisiana and Texas, with headquarters in New Orleans. And military districts mean it's an occupation. They're an occupying force. They were all established in 1867. So it's not even immediate. So there's a 2-year period, and then the military occupation goes in. So I think that's important, that break. So it's not just the Civil War and then the military occupation. It's the fact that there was nothing, and then all of a sudden occupation, and that definitely could instigate, growing violence, apprehension, and so forth. The Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 was a congressional act that set up these districts. And there were 4 statutes that, overrode the veto of that president, Andrew Johnson. So I know I usually don't like to mention president names, but in this context, I think,
He kind
yeah,
of deserved, yeah.
yeah,
He's probably the worst president ever, honestly. But
so they vetoed him, and
'cause
by
he was like that's when these black codes got passed, and he was basically allying himself in many
hmm
ways with the
hmm
South.
yeah,
But the Republican Party was so organized at the time that, like, as they called them, the radical Republicans,
yeah,
that like they could overpower his, whatever he
yeah.
was on.
And so they established they established martial law. Tennessee was only excluded because, they pretty much understood what was happening, and they quickly ratified. They accepted the 14th Amendment, which allowed it to be a state. So that's the only sort of state that was did not go under military sort of occupation or control.
Which is interesting considering that's where actually the Klan starts.
Exactly. Which is an important point. Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
So And so like, a lot of armchair historians may want to talk about, the reconciliation of Andrew Johnson and Confederate veterans, and particularly, those of wealth and all that type of stuff. But, I think, again, this all comes after, all of that. It comes after, the post-Civil War Black codes. It comes, after, ways in which, a lot of other things had already, begun. So I think that was a shift in the sort of social experience of many of these Southerners, that, the war was over and they thought, not much was going to happen. They, no slaves clearly, but not like they're going to lose their house, and that type of thing. But military occupation, changed all of that. So for me, I think the Klan formation is less about like a post-war anger and more about an anger because of occupation. The second sort of thing that I think sort of spurs this on is, there are a number of reactions to freedmen. So, Black men and women, become free. And so there's these, list of what we know as, freedmen massacres that happen, 18, 19 in total. And so when we zoom out and see a connection between them all, we can look at them as an, outrage or response to, Black people, getting state designated, freedom.
Hmm.
So we can look at the locations, Memphis Massacre in 1866,
Yep.
right? And that's within, the month of May, and Black veterans are targeted specifically in that particular case. The Camellia Massacre in Georgia in 1868, and the little less known Colfax Massacre, 1873 in the month of April, Louisiana, and that's,
There was there was rioting in Meridian, Mississippi.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you already said Colfax. Yeah,
And numbers of people. I mean, like, and this is why we're talking. This is an incredibly violent period.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Look, like you're talking in Mississippi. That was a smaller one. 30 black people were killed.
And just so people can understand, 30 Black people in a town or city of 1,000, that's significant.
Yeah, that's a
You know,
lot.
yeah,
There the one duh, 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 there was one in Opelousas,
yeah.
Louisiana.
Yeah. I'll go through them. I'll go
Yeah,
through them.
okay,
Yeah. And so, yeah. But and the Hamburg massacre in 1876 in South Carolina. So, I mean, that's one in particular I want to, come back to in particular. But
that's an important
I'll
one.
go through all of them. But Camellia massacre, I'm just gonna, mention that one again because that's one of the ones that's an outright clear example of Klan-led violence, right? So that's one that the Klan was organized, they were present there, and they are leading the acts. And this is 1868. Eric Foner, the scholar, says that this period and this particular incident was the most violent. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. I don't know if it even needs to be distinct because every last one of these were,
Yeah, it was ongoing.
ongoing,
Yeah.
so I think what matters is the standard that there was, that there is a reaction to official structures failing to do what they perceived was their function. The United States should be looking out for them, maybe not necessarily them as white people, but just them as who they are. And here all of a sudden they're under occupation, and occupation means occupation that, there's street patrols of U.S. troops, telling people move along, and the people that are telling move along are not the Black people, right? It's
Which is again from their perspective is probably mind-boggling considering they were just slaves, you
mind-boggling, right? Yeah, it's just like what is going on? Like what is happening? This is horrible, right? And I'll probably talk about some more just of that sort of space and environment because it could be incredible, but I think the force acts are tied to this discussion, and I know we'll get to the force acts a little bit later, but kind of invoking geographies of threat, the book, I mentioned this whole notion that the state encourages the people of the fabricated society to call for greater state violence, right?
Mm.
The state always has a monopoly on violence. So any violence that happens, it's okayed by the state, but it doesn't mean it's sort of like created by it. Sometimes it could be, but sometimes it's just allowed. So legitimate only means needed or sanctioned, and it does not include illegitimate. And in the case of the first Klan, it appears that it is not in concert with the government or the state, which is also probably surprising to what people think about. Maybe a eventually new emerging state, it's in concert with
Yeah,
that.
like the ones they failed to bring in, but like the red shirts and then were able to bring
Exactly,
in.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. But in this period, it is not, especially under Grant, it is not in concert, it is not sanctioned at all, and so there's the Enforcement Acts, 1870, 1871, three acts, and all the bills were aimed at, protecting Black people. Yes, for the listeners, you heard me correctly, explicitly to protect Black people.
Yeah,
Like
well, yeah.
that just, I know that's not, that does not like compute, and that's may lead people to try to fact check, and please do, and it's just like, huh? Like, and I'm not talking about in a roundabout, vague way. No, that's the direct intent of these acts. They saw the massacres that were beginning to happen, and Congress was like, we have to move on it. And then once Grant becomes president, he's enforcing it with military force. So protection.
Even the militia law, we'll get to this
Oh,
probably later, but the one
oh
that
man.
with
Yeah. Yeah.
Parson Bronslow,
Yeah.
they I do well since we're talking about, I'll just read it now because we may get I did this one. I had known about the federal, but I didn't know about some of these state-based laws. I mean, to imagine this even being given to us today is crazy. But they said September 10th, 1968, the first provided a minimum penalty of $500, which is a lot of money back then, at 5 years in a penitentiary for anyone belonging to, siding with, or encouraging any secret organization that prowled by day or night in or out of disguise, quote, for the purpose of disturbing the peace or alarming peaceful citizens. This penalty also applied to anyone advising resistance to laws or anyone who threatened or intimidated a voter. But then, this is the part that got me. Victims of Ku Klux attacks were authorized to kill their assailants. And failing that, to sue for damages for $10,000. This new militia law empowered the governor to organize a state guard and send to any county where 10 Union men certified that the law could not be enforced and citizens protected without military aid. So Black people were able to form militias legally, you know, if they wanted to, and they did, to fight against the Klan. And in some cases, you can go over even to like Mississippi, was armed by the state when they formed these militias, right? Like this is in the book We Will Shoot Back. He talks about that too. So it's like it's wild to think that in this country that we know today that was once upon a time a thing. And I'm even reading further about that. The Klan in Tennessee was so worried about the militias that they actually preferred the guards or preferred the troops to the
Exactly.
militias.
Exactly. Exactly.
because
Yeah.
because the militias because they didn't, even if they thought they could ultimately win against the Black militias, they were like, this is too much, and it was a little bit more unpredictable. So they actually tried to cut a deal with the governor, like, let's just submit to the troops because those are easy to attack. We don't really want to deal with the militias. But again, like to your point, it's hard to believe that that was even ever a thing, considering where we are today, especially, right?
Yeah. I mean, and we want to parade around with celebrating, the civil rights era for doing certain things with Black people, but these three force acts are unlike any other laws ever as it applied to Black people. in the entire history of the United States, still
Yeah,
to
by far. Yeah.
and just still to this present day. Now I'm not trying to completely sort of praise Grant, because Grant was horrible to the indigenous populations,
Yeah.
horrible. And so reasons why we even see black troops was because of Grant's openness and support of black populations, but utter hatred of
To then
indigenous
displace.
populations.
Yeah. Yeah, to then displace and yeah, and
Yeah,
be
yeah.
involved in that in some case. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just I mean, it's madness. I mean, you literally you have to keep reading it over and over again, because you don't quite believe what you're reading when you look at the wording of any of these enforcement acts. Um, I mean, again, I know we'll get into these enforcement acts a little bit later, but the last one is literally known as the Ku Klux
The
Klan
Klan.
Act, and it's just like, huh? Like yeah. And so vigilantism is that reaction to those conditions, the occupation, and the sort of shuffling of the racial order. And this is concentrated, in the southern states, except for, Tennessee. Um, and probably the origin happening in Tennessee is because they probably weren't, they didn't have to worry about, U.S. troops,
Mm-hmm.
coming in on the meeting, and so forth. So Tennessee would allow some obscurity, some secrecy, and some, an ability,
A little
ability
bit of
to be
freedom of
safe, to
freedom
be
of
safe.
movement. Yeah.
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 Because, the Force Acts again, allowed for people to shoot the Klan on sight. And so if people had an understanding that the Klan was meeting or what would become the Klan was, being formed, that entire building could have been set on fire, if not, fired upon, and so it's likely that Tennessee is probably chosen, as a location because of that. Now, we don't have evidence of that, and maybe there is some diary out there that sort of, explicitly,
Right.
mentions that. We don't have that yet, but the geography of vigilantism is important to some also talk about, in the sense that it's not exclusive to the South and Southern culture. It's just that this is how, it looked in the South. As we know, the South, and the North were dangerous, but also the West Coast. West Coast, they had what they know, what's known as vigilance committees, right? And one of the big, well-known vigilance committees on the West Coast was the Committee of the 15 in Tacoma, Washington. And, they led a number of attacks on people, Los Angeles massacre of 1871, the San Francisco race riot of 1877, the Denver race riot of 1880, the Rock Springs, Wyoming massacre, and the Tacoma, Washington riot of 1885, and the Seattle riot of 1886, and the Pacific Coast race riot of 1907. This is just to name a few. No Klan, but definitely vigilantes, but under this official sort of vigilance committee sort of title. And
Mm-hmm.
mind you, all those that I just listed were attacks exclusively upon Chinese populations and other Asian groups. So this is not including any sort of riots, massacres of, indigenous, Latinx, and particularly Black populations. These were just though that list is just of Chinese, laborers, or just general residents that were lynched, beaten in public to death, or ran out of a town or a city.
Is some of these groups were nameless. Obviously, they didn't, they acted on their own without really any name. What were some of the names of these the group? Not obviously not the Klan, but some of these other groups that either preceded the Klan or sometimes were working at the same time as the Klan. Like, what were some of these other groups?
Yeah, preceded the Klan. The Know Nothings, were nativists. That was their ideology. The Know Nothings were, important enough that they actually ran a president. Millett Fillmore. And, and so it's one of the few cases of one of these obscure groups, being organized enough to, have a representative of theirs, have the highest executive, function in the United States. No, nothing was operated a little bit more like a sort of, uh, a political party, but no, but nonetheless, they're a precursor, and they were also quite capable of engaging in violence. And they were influenced by nativism, you know, with heavy focus against, immigrant groups. The White Caps are a precursor to the Klan. And then the Knights of Camellia and the White League are like contemporaries of the Klan. And then those groups that come after the Klan are like the Red Shirts, the Regulators, the Horse Thief Detective Association, and then, like I said, vigilance committees, peace societies, even ethnic athletic associations were all of this. There's some other groups like the Ball Knobbers that operated in, and they all have, specific geographic locations that they're associated with, but not necessarily, they are in conversation with each other. Even in the case of when they're in proximity to each other, like the Klan, the White League, and the Red Shirts, and the Knights of Camellia, they're not in, they're not working with each other at all. They just seem to be active at the same time.
Yeah. There was the Black Horse Cavalry,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Pale Faces, a few others, but yeah, that's yeah. Again, just want to lay that out for people because again, it's like that's another thing about this history is it's like we think the Klan was the only thing that like fills it and or we'll say everything well they're all the Klan and I get when people are talking about this kind of casually they're just saying they're all bad people basically and I
Yeah,
understand
yeah.
why people do that so it's not necessarily but when you're trying to really study the history the differences again start to matter more than if we're just casually talking about whether
And
they
if
were bad people or not
And if we're talking about body count, the White League and the Red Shirts probably definitively outdo the Klan, the first Klan in terms of how many people that they killed, as well as how many members they had themselves. Because in certain cases, they would come into a city with 3,000, members, as a force to take over the city. So yeah, yeah. So I mean, I know there's so many different sort of facets of this that we'll touch on, but I think that's yeah, exactly. I think it's important for people to hear that there are other groups. The Klan is not the lead group, and also the Klan plays a certain, geographic, specificity. It plays some sort of role, but they are not the major, role, especially in the remaining parts of this period of time, before we even get to the 20th century.
Yeah, they don't even really make it through Reconstruction. I mean,
No, no.
in terms of any real influence, they don't actually make it through Reconstruction. And why Reconstruction ends is not really they don't really have much to do to do with that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess I could just clear up the Force Acts just so we don't forget it. So, like the Enforcement Act of 1870, prohibited discrimination with a penalty, a financial penalty, but it was backed by the army. And like I said, this led to street patrols by, military troops. Klan were arrested or, and also there were, incidents of death of Klan members. Um, and this one act alone nearly eradicated the Klan just by itself. And so then there's the Second Enforcement Act of 1871 that had, gave complete federal oversight over all voting and elections, specifically for towns of like 20,000 people or more. if they asked for it. And there were then way more severity, with the violations to this particular, right to vote, right to run for office. In
They could
fact,
suspend habeas corpus, right?
uh, that's actually the next one.
71.
Yeah. So well, there's two in 71.
Oh, I'm thinking 1870. Okay, okay.
Yeah. And so, so this, what they call the Second Enforcement Act, of 1871, this is actually stronger than the Civil Rights Act of 1875, because this act could lead to imprisonment if you were found to be a Klan member, operating as a Klan member, or operating as any of one of these vigilante groups. Then you have the Enforcement Act of 1871. I know it's a confusing name. This is why it's also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. And this is the third and final one. So the Enforcement Act of 1870, the Second Enforcement Act of 1871, and then the Enforcement Act of 1871. Again, weird naming, but it allowed for the president specifically to employ a militia, which is what you spoke to earlier. So beyond just the army, a militia can be formed to suppress any attempts,
This is the federal law again. I was
federal law.
state law.
And and basically, he knew what he was drafting. He meant a militia likely of predominantly black folks, for any attempts or conspiracy against the United States. And as you alluded to it, it suspended habeas corpus, which means, the right to, basic, understandings of citizenship, representation. And so basically, granted people the right to shoot to kill on sight any Klan member, which just makes, like, again, it just does not make any sense, right? Like in our context of what has and has not happened, right? And so a Klan member could be shot on sight because of the final Ku Klux Klan Act. Klan members were already being killed with the other ones, but this one just outright, made it completely legal. And it also went after the Knights of Camellia. So this is one of the reasons why the Knights of Camellia aren't active in the sort of later stuff. It's only the red shirts, and so the acts are technically still in the books. There's been lawsuits against them. There's been lawsuits against even the current president,
Yeah.
with this particular law because of,
2020. Yeah.
yeah, because of the sort of voter intimidation, voter suppression. An attorney can sort of say that this is in violation of the Enforcement Act. There's also been trials that have used the Enforcement Act. So, you know, back in the day, after the Colfax massacre, all those perpetrators were tried under that particular sort of act, and I think it was like 90 something that were indicted, and 19 went to jail for it. And then it was challenged in 1883 by a sheriff in Tennessee. And so basically, that sheriff won ultimately the Supreme Court case, saying that it should be the state and not the federal that grants the ability to criminalize assault or murder. Because basically the Enforcement Acts basically gave the federal government power to say this person committed murder, this person committed an assault. And so
So that is
this,
that how you get the distinctions between what we even know now in terms of like the state is over, like I'm talking about not the state, but like the state of Indiana, for instance, is over like all criminal prosecutions unless it's a
yes,
federal law. That's
yes,
actually I didn't
yes,
know that.
yes. And so I mean, like, in the legal history of the United States, these three acts are also incredibly important. And yet this is like a part of the Reconstruction that none of us ever learned or understood. Like, I'd never heard of the Force Acts until I was researching lynching. Most of us heard about Reconstruction,
Yeah, you hear about public schools.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
but the force acts, like in any context, even just that they exist, much less like what they did. And so, yeah, and also it was more famously sort of applied to the murders, 1964, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwimmer. The third Klan was tried. So this is how the FBI sort of came in and put a bunch of people on trial for
Those were
their
the civil rights activists that went missing during the summer of '64, right? And then
exactly,
their bodies
exactly.
were found. That was in Mississippi, correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So again, just want to have people have that sense of the force acts, and so you wouldn't have these acts if people weren't doing stuff, that would require these acts. So this kind of gives you a sense of the scale of the activity that was happening in terms of the violence that was being perpetrated specifically to Black people by, you know, just general people, veterans, Confederate veterans, then Klan members, and then members of the Knights of Camellia, and then, the White League, and then, the Red Shirts. This is how much it was happening that the federal government literally, not just occupied the South, then created actual laws that allowed everyday citizens to kill the Klan.
Yes, I had to laugh because again, that's you just can't imagine that today. Can't say it's a bad idea though. But, but I'll leave it at that. But I guess to walk it back to all right, we get a I think we got a broad a somewhat general sense of how this went down.
Mhm.
But how what are the origins of the Klan? Like, how does the like? And we keep saying the Klan, and I think it's also important to know like that's not even what they went by at the time.
Right, right. Yeah, great point. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The Klan part of it came. The other K's were the ones that they used. That last K wasn't necessarily how they got referred to. So like
True. Good point.
again,
Great
we
point.
said coming back to the myth of Indiana, we again, it's not hard to really debunk this Indiana point, but as I said at the beginning, this is Pulaski, Tennessee, which is kind of like in between Memphis and Nashville. It's kind
Yeah,
of
it's almost right in the middle, like
yeah,
perfectly.
and Middle Tennessee is a term if you go to Tennessee. Like people say things like Middle Tennessee or whatever, because I think I'm assuming it's based on the fact that those two big cities are on opposite ends and also like opposite corners of the state, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
So so I don't know exactly how many miles away it is, but like you said, the Memphis massacre or the Memphis riots happened in 1866. So the history is that the Klan starts in 1867-ish, and that's debatable. So like what are the origins, like the very beginnings of
Yeah.
this? And were these people former slave masters? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what are the beginnings of it?
Yeah, no, no, and yeah, it's a great point that yeah, the Klan as a term, I mean, literally, if we were transported to that era, one, I don't know what I would do if I was trans. I mean, like,
That's true.
people ask those, have those questions. I'm like, no, I don't want to
At all.
at all. I don't want to arrive like, what I mean.
Like,
But if somehow I had no choice and I was transported to that time period, I was talking about like we need to watch out for the Klan. They would be thinking about like, but you're not Scottish or Irish. What are you talking about? And so right, we're used to saying the Klan as shorthand, and no, they would be saying somebody was cluxed or Klux, and if you were favorable, Ku Klux meant that you were awakened, you were
you were
woke,
woke.
you
Yeah.
were woke, you finally came to your senses of your true
That's
self.
hilarious. When I saw that, I didn't know that one when we were reading. That was hilarious to think that that was considered woke, and then
Yeah,
here
yeah,
we are.
yeah. Because the term was being wide awake,
Yeah.
wide awake, right? Um, I mean, we're not lying, y'all. That literally, this is, but yeah. And so So if you it was favorable, Ku Klux meant that you were awakened, and then if you were an enemy, Ku Klux meant that you either got your ass beat or you were killed. And or if it was a state, it meant that the state was now being either under occupation or being about to be under the process. So Ku Klux was the name that they referred to. It was both a noun and a verb, in most cases. And yeah, for the most part, I have a sense that Pulaski, but 1865, right after the Civil War in December, there's now discussions for it, right? But it's in April 1867 that representatives of the Klan from several states met in Nashville. So that's where the two dates come up. So the Klan is kind of created in 1865, but it doesn't really become a true national organization or organization in multiple places in 1867, because when they come together in Nashville, they're drawing up the first Constitution.
Right.
And yes, at that particular time, the majority of members in that organization were veterans of the Confederate Army, various ranks. Um, and of course, they were primarily sort of against, radical Republicans, and of course, reestablishing or restoring what they thought was the appropriate racial order.
And
Um,
what were the names of these people? Just so they're on record.
I mean, the key person is Bedford Forrest, who is sort of leading this discussion. The other, chapter members of this particular meeting is somewhat obscure, and also it's not consistent with, some of the names. But Bedford Forrest is what I think would open the doorway for most people who are sort of listening to this and wishing to sort of look into more of it. But the problem is that no one understands why this name is chosen. Some people have tried to say that it's tied, has some Greek etymological, origins, which it might have. And like Kuklos means circle. Some people, but other people have said that Ku Klux sounds like the rifle, cocking back, being loaded, you know. But there's no confirmed reason why this is chosen. Um, again, it's not to say that it's not out there. It's just that we haven't come across the right diary, you
No,
know.
it's kind of more of urban legend, especially
Yeah,
when you go back to the Pulaski part of it, where it's these like bored ass white boys, like,
yeah, exactly.
like
Yeah,
seriously, like
yeah,
just bored ass white boys. And there's these stories that they sat down, they were trying to kind of come up with a name, and then like you said, Ku Klux just comes up because it has a certain meaning to it, and these weren't even, at least that original band of folks, they weren't even like they didn't own any slaves or anything like that. They were of like privilege, I guess, they were
yeah. But
lawyers.
but the Greek etymology does make sense then when you think about the fraternal aspect of it. So these people were educated. Even though I know for a lot of black people, we think fraternities and sororities started at the same time as black fraternities and sororities started. And in most cases, that's farther from the truth, where in a lot of cases, some of these fraternities and sororities have, but at this particular point now, almost a 200-year, history. And so this is why then there's three letters, right? Just like any other fraternal organization that people were a part of had three particular letters. So there is some potential hold up. Well, there's some potential sort of resonance with possibly Kuklos, the Greek origin, maybe being the basis of it because of that. But again, no specific confirmation. But within the Constitution, it establishes, the following aims. This is an institution. So, quote, this is an institution of chivalry, humanity, mercy, and patriotism, embodying in its genius and its principles all that is chivalric in conduct, noble in sentiment, generous in manhood, and patriotic in purpose, is peculiar objects being first to protect the weak, the innocent, and the defenseless from the indignities, wrongs, and outrages of the lawless, the violent, and the brutal, to relieve the injured and oppressed, to succor the suffering and unfortunate, and especially the widows and orphans of Confederate soldiers. Second, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States and all laws passed in conformity thereto, and to protect the states and the people thereof from all invasions from any source whatsoever. And third, to aid and assist in the execution of all constitutional laws, and to protect the people from unlawful seizure and from trial except by their peers in conformity to the laws of the land. So that was the sort of original aims. Now, in some of this, it may seem confusing in relation to what we're talking about when they're talking about the Constitution of the United States and so forth. So in many cases, they see that role as correcting the wrong. Like, so the current regime running the United States at this particular time period is a, unlawful regime that needs to be changed.
Right.
So not the United States needs to be, gotten rid of. A white nation can only arise if we can get rid of these people who are in political office, so that the true Constitution, the true interpretation of the Constitution, can be sort of upheld. And when they say from all invasions, they're talking, that they're speaking on the spirit of what they're living under, which is the occupation of the South. Because as we mentioned earlier, the occupation happens 2 years after the end of the Civil War. So no one was seeing this coming, that they were going to be under military occupation whatsoever. And so as time passed on, and support was lost, the Klan's, social elite kind of goes away. That's the kind of fraternal period. And it became more of a fraternity of poor white citizens. And so Forrest technically formally disbands the Klan in 1869, but he doesn't run it. So it keeps going. He just
It didn't really have strong, like, top end. It was more of a bottom up at that point, right? It
yeah.
didn't really have like a
Wait,
direct,
wait.
like, the so even the frame, because I'm looking at it too, even the way they have the Grand Wizard and the
Hmm.
and all of that, like the Grand Wizard didn't really have pool like that, because Grand Wizard, for people, we don't have to get into the weird. It is weird reading their titles, like Grand Wizard, Grand Dragon, realm of his eight hydras. Like, it's weird shit, like what Marvel shit or whatever. But, like, it didn't have like this very centralized structure that it
Right.
eventually comes to have, or like we might think of other organizations to have. It was not that.
Right. Right. And so, so 1869, he tries to disband it. So in one sense, we can recognize that date for what he's doing, but not because it does what he says it's doing. It just indicates that, for some parts of it, it ended, and other parts were trying to continue, but not for too long, because it's 1869. And so it wasn't completely crushed until the Force Acts of the 1870 and 1871 were written. And so, again, as we already mentioned, you can understand why the Klan was crushed. It wasn't that they were legislated out. It wasn't that they, their hearts were appealed to and they turned, favorably into another direction. They were scared to death to, be associated, or to, in any particular way, to be affiliated with the Klan. And so some people just didn't want to even go underground. They wanted to, like, end it, because suspicion was still enough to off somebody. It wasn't like you could only do this if you saw them literally in their hoods. And it's also important to note that, like you said, like, there's not consistency. So all of them did not wear white.
Uh,
There's images of, their uniforms in this time period, some of which are, red and white, but not red, not like all white with a red cross. but no, all red with like looks like a bishop, like with a stall that's white, you know.
Some of them did like would paint their faces black.
Yeah, yeah,
The Parsons book was helpful. Some of them wore women's clothing. Um,
yeah,
it was all, and again, the psychology of that I'm not really interested in, but to your point, it wasn't as uniform as you would think. Speaking of Indiana, when you go look at the pictures of the Indiana Klan, that was very uniform. They had systematized way of making their uniforms. That was another thing. A lot of these uniforms really were just sewn together by whoever could do it. There wasn't like
yeah.
a place that pumped them out.
Right,
Like
yeah.
you can get it on Amazon or something. You
Right,
know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
yeah.
Like it wasn't that like industrialized or organized. Like it just wasn't.
And so these other groups begin to emerge, because not only are the frustrations growing, but also they don't like the Klan because they thought this whole idea of secrecy was, insufficient. You know, they wanted to be open. So the White League, Knights of Camellia, and Red Shirts were very open with, who they were, operating in full sort of view of the public. The Klan would try to, suppress any news of their activities in the local newspaper. Red shirts would, try to get an interview, or write the article themselves and get it put into the newspaper. And so in a sense, these groups broke away from the Klan because they felt that the Klan was foolish and was insufficient in many different ways.
Before we move on to the red shirts and the end of Reconstruction, just so people can get a sense of the gravity, can you talk a little bit about what the Klan actually did when they attacked people? Because I think people do need to hear, like what kind of violence did they actually engage in? I got some examples on my own notes, and then who are they targeting? Because I think another reading through this for me was it's not that all black people were vulnerable to this, but it was interesting to see the kind of folks tactically that they were targeting. Um, so like who were they targeting? What was the kind of violence? What was the purpose of it? Like, just to get a sense of, like, obviously we know they targeted black people and white Republicans, but like more specifically, who were they targeting?
Yeah, I mean, so there's, the sort of individual action. When I say individual acts, I mean, you know, going after one person, that type of stuff. And then there's the sort of mass acts, which were the massacres. And so I think more importantly, the massacres, especially very early on, first they were targeting black men, veterans, specifically, and that's important to note. It supports the notion of this being a response, not from just some sort of feeling. They are responding to, again, the occupation and the changing of the racial order. So, again, some of the first massacres are specifically targeting black men who are veterans, former veteran, or they were active, enlisted persons, right? So that was who, at least from my read, were sort of the targets of the initial sort of attacks. As we sort of move along, 1868, 1874, now you start seeing, widespread all black people being targeted, in a particular town or location. Some of these, were of course just the typical, gunshot, not a drive-by in a sense, no, but actually, assassination style, shooting in the back of the head, or blowing off the face. But in other cases, dipping people in, boiling water, you know, uh, flame, so those people who may remember, Game of Thrones, the Boltons were known for flaying people, skinning people while they're alive. Uh, these were some of the acts. I forgot his name, but there's unfortunately a young researcher, maybe for the second episode I can remember it, but he has this book called Delectable Black People. And basically, it sums up different sort of case examples of black people being eaten by people, being cut up, or parts of them being cut up, and put into dishes, and so forth. Sounds crazy, but the brother did his research. Unfortunately, he's not with us. He passed away at a very young age. This was his only publication, extensively researched and so forth. But these were some of at least the sort of specific acts of violence that were done. And some of, and just calling them lynchings are kind of like,
It's not far enough.
yeah, it doesn't really capture, because it just seems like they just like hung somebody up. Like, no, like it would be, a torturous process, both before the hanging and then during the hanging and all of that, and in a sense, potentially this is a time period where maybe lynchings were perfected, in terms of how they were being conducted. Tar and feathering was a sort of popular thing, and tar, if for some people who may not have ever done sort of certain type of labor, is the important material that you put on roof to, insulate and protect the roof, but also this is what the shingles that are on your roof kind of sticks to. And so imagine that on your skin. You have to heat tar, you have to like heat it up. And so they're putting hot tar on people. And, there's cases in which you can sort of look at the pictures of people who have had some of their tar removed and like, but they couldn't get it all removed. So the rest of their life, they may have patches of like part of their skin that still has tar on it, because if they cut off that particular part, it would be too deep of a cut.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. It, just to add to the horror, just another one that of many that stuck out. This was in the White Terror book. About 100 of them, as in Klansmen in full disguise, rode into a town and lynched a Negro confined for attempted rape. Taking him at gunpoint, they did not wait to get him out of town, but riddled him with bullets on one of the main streets
mm,
and then departed. The body was left for omnibus to run over soon after and for the public to observe the next morning. That was just so there was a lot of stories. It seemed like there was some kind of tactical thing where it was like a ritual thing where they wouldn't just like shoot you real quick. They would, whip. They also whipped people, like quite literally. People would get lashes. That was another thing that they did a lot of. Then they might actually not even kill you. In some cases, they just send you back to let everybody know what happened to you. To kind of spread the terror in that way. And then in some cases, like in this one, or like what you said, that people were dead. I think it's just important to note this, not to get caught up in the grotesqueness of it, but this is why they needed to be shot down. This is why like this is why there was militias. This is like so people understand this wasn't just so we're not catering to any of the Southern narratives that this was somehow unfair. It's like no, this is why people needed to come for you like that because you're just doing this all around, and then they were very specific. Yes, they would target all black folks but it was also the ones that resisted, the people who were trying to vote. That's why those force acts were passed. Black leadership, jurors, anyone that was engaged in any kind of they often they would attack people after meetings. For some reason they wouldn't attack meetings. But and it's even sometimes when they didn't even kill you, they would go into town and say, y'all can't have a party, y'all need to leave. Or
right, right,
here's a notice, you need to get out of here. Right. And then ultimately, like, you might see some of those folks get killed. So just saying, like, people need to know, like, the violence that these folks was engaged in was not just like some like Minnie Mouse bullshit, where you could, like you said, you could change their minds through some kind of book club or something like that. It was
This
like
was
yeah,
it was revenge and
yeah,
punishment,
yeah.
you know.
Like
And just for the records, I did find it. So Vincent Woodard is the author, and again, he passed away. Uh, but the book came out, some time ago, and it's called again "The Delectable Negro: Human Consumption and Homoeroticism Within the U.S. Slave Culture." So, he's primarily, identifying a period of time in which, of course, enslaved populations were doing it, but it doesn't like end,
no,
at this particular point. You know, now this don't, I can already see people, taking some of what we're saying and running with it. In no way are we saying that this was the case for every single case. But their violence, violence is violence. So whether the person is just being shot or the person is being riddled with bullets or the person is being flayed, the point is that people were killed in mass, either, in trickled numbers with, one individual here, another individual here, or in large groups, with considerable amounts of people in different, cities, right?
ran out of towns.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was the thing, at least in the White Terror book, he was saying that the bigger cities became, relatively speaking, like a hub of refuge, like a Nashville or a Memphis. This is you stick with Tennessee, versus if you got out there in the more rural town area, like you were left for dead, like because the troops weren't really out there like that as much either. They
Yeah,
weren't.
yeah, I think you said it earlier, but the Opelousas massacre of September 1868 in Louisiana, this was primarily the Knights of the White Camellia. They were the ones that were more active in this case. Well, 20 to 30% of the city were the members of the Knights of Camellia. That's about 3,000 people at this time. And they actually used the Klan's name on notes that they left around, but there's no Klan in the entire city. But 20 to 30% of the city all being members of this sort of body, no, you would quickly go to, New Orleans. Not to say that New Orleans is completely, safe, but it's a bigger city. You can hide with a larger population, and you can also, be with others in defense of
Yeah, in
yourself.
defense, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, again,
um,
that's why I say relatively speaking, and not like
mhm.
we said, we don't want to, you and I wouldn't want to hop on that time machine at all. Like, and it's like, but if I did, yeah, I'd rather go to Memphis than Pulaski, you know what I mean? Like if I had to
Right.
pick,
Yeah, right.
like,
Yeah.
like put me in a militia or something if I got it, but nobody wants to go back to this regardless, right? But yeah, like again, this is important. Not like I'm glad we didn't hop right into the violence because a lot of times those people lead with for the sake of like being dramatic or just like look at what was done to us. But it's like to understand why such drastic laws may even made sense. Uh, like if this is the stuff you're doing to people, and even if people are just living with the threat of that, even if obviously everybody didn't experience that, like you know. Like this isn't a functional thing. But I guess, like you said, to kind of move it forward, these other groups learn from the Klan, like learn from their mistakes, learn from their lack of organization, learn, from their lack of discipline,
Mhm.
and are still, if anything, like you said earlier, more violent. But do it in a more, I guess, it's not any less subtle. It's just more. It's just tactically. It's more. It's more lined up. So can you talk? I guess getting close to the end, like more so. How did that? Like, okay, the Klan gets basically ended in 71 ish.
Mhm. Right.
Um, but these other groups start to emerge, a lot of the kind of 1619 project types. We'll talk about 1877, 1876 and compromise, but
what really emerges post the Klan that is able to take white violence and put it in a more in a stronger position, you know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I noticed that people don't really speak to in referring to, these groups, they talk about terror groups and or they talk about, um, again, white supremacist groups, hate groups. But I think a better sort of terminology, especially when you look at this particular time period, is these are paramilitary organizations.
Yeah.
It's not that they just happen to kill somebody in between bingo games. Like, they were intentionally sort of armed and engaged in either loose organization of, violence or, incredible organization of violence.
Right. So this wasn't in your like violence continuum, you talk about the difference between like targeted and like recreational killing.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is
And so,
recreational.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, these aren't, this is not, recreational murder lynchings are happening also at the same time period. Maybe some of the members as individuals, not affiliated with the organization, are engaged in this, but the actual organizations are themselves planning operations, moving from state to state, moving from city to city. So these massacres aren't like by accident or by chance. They are being instigated, right? So Camellia Massacre was the one that's more Klan led. The New Orleans Massacre of 1868 was more ex-Confederates and New Orleans police. And then, like I said, Opelousas Massacre of 1868, also in Louisiana, was the Knights of White Camellia. The election massacre of 1874, which is also an important thing. I know we talked about war, but elections also become a peak time of violence, around an election time. So the election massacre of 1874 in Alabama ran away about 1,500 black voters with an attempted coup. And this was the White League. And then there's the Colchata massacre in Louisiana in 1874. That was the White League again. The Battle of Liberty Place in New Orleans, 1874. That was another insurrection by the White League to take over the city. You know, instead of an attack on black people, they were there to take over the city, and that was roughly about 5,000 members of the White League. And then the Ellington riot in South Carolina, that's 1876, and that was more so smaller, what they were calling rifle clubs, and that's where the red shirts, are birthed from. They're a rifle club of the Democratic Party. And so the red shirts then organized those smaller, separate rifle clubs as then chapters of the red shirts.
And
Post.
what is the you can finish that, but after you finish that, I'm curious, what's the symbol of red shirt? Like what? Yeah.
Blood. Yeah, blood. Blood stain. Because at this particular point, to in many ways to not invoke the Confederate gray. At this particular point, they're representing political opinion, and so while there's some people of the South and some people that are former Confederates, but some people are also, were Union, veterans. And so a unifying color was the blood that they shed for a false, regime. And so the red, so red shirts. But again, they were presented as a sort of rifle club. And they organized then those smaller rifle clubs as then chapters after this Ellington riot. And then there's the Hamburg massacre, which
They were major in that one. Yeah.
huge, and this is the one that then spiraled into the Wilmington massacre and then the Atlanta race riot. The red shirts just began to, really take over, and they moved from one place to another. It's important to also note, like, how the, rifle clubs but they were also known as saber clubs. So basically, they would go to a range, right? And to a public, they would look like just a social club with arms, but and in actuality, they were, that they're the armed, part of a political party. I know most people in the United States don't understand political parties not having a political arm, a military arm, but that's kind of normal in a lot of other contexts, and it was normal here in the United States up until a certain particular point. But they had a motto called "Force without violence." Um, and so it was sort of like a tongue-in-cheek
That,
slogan.
that sounds like what's Trump and them say? Strength, peace by strength. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and but the red shirts, the actual uniform, harkens back to those horsemen that sort of accompanied this one particular Confederate officer, Wade Hampton, and so and it starts in South Carolina and it moves to sort of again different particular spaces.
And they didn't wear masks, right?
No,
Yeah.
none of
They
these other
wanted you
groups.
to know.
They want, yeah.
Yeah.
There's this one really good political cartoon of the Hamburg massacre where it shows a person from the White League shaking hands with a person from the Klan, with underneath their hands that are like shaking hands in confirmation of each other. There's a black family cowering underneath their shaking hands, and it's a pretty well-known political cartoon of that era. And so in a sense, acknowledging how these two sort of disparate groups that didn't agree with each other were willing to sort of, work hand in hand with each other in sort of different particular spaces, different pockets. Some of these red shirts, you know, retired and then became, members of political office, and some people retained their involvement. Ben Tillman, is big in the South, especially South Carolina, and especially associated with Clemson University. There's a building named after Ben Tillman and everything. He was a senator from 1895 to 1918. He was a governor of South Carolina from 1890 to
Yeah.
1895,
And he was a red shirt, just to,
and he was a red shirt. Um, and an active red shirt. So it's not that he retired, and this is a person also with a disability, right? So, and so he was quite active. In fact, one of his more famous, comments was in anger of the president bringing Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner to talk about race relations. And he was so angered at President Roosevelt for doing that, he says, quote, "The action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that nigger will necessitate our killing 1,000 niggers in the South before they learn their place again."
Yeesh.
I think I've read that quote. I just don't think I ever attributed it to a red shirt. Like I didn't.
And that was Ben Tillman. That's
Yeah.
Ben Tillman, and he says that in another particular quote, that he actually gives as a speech on Congress, on the floor of Congress, was, "We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. We have never believed in him to be the equal of the white man, and we will not submit to his gratifying his lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him." So this is a
Like
speech.
you said, he was active. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a speech that he gave. Um, so yeah. So really important distinction, but yeah, this shows how one what we've obscured probably in thinking about it as a myth. This Klan is really technically so insignificant to this time period. It's one of a bunch of different groups. It doesn't start a wave of violence. It doesn't lead a wave of violence. It just happens to be just another group. And so the fact that, we have a perception of their magnitude is quite false. And I know we'll get into it with the second, Klan, because what we perceive of the Klan visually is kind of based off of the second Klan, but we think it's the first Klan that sort of has this sort of appearance.
Yeah, and I guess you're speaking to they don't they didn't really dominate this period. Maybe for a small time, like for a few years, right? But for the most part, they were, if we took out our understanding of what we know the Klan to become and we just put them in context in this era, it would be the way we kind of passingly describe some of these other orgs,
Yeah,
like the
yeah,
Black Legions or so. Like they would just be the pale faces. I'm saying they would be mentioned in a group, but maybe not in the prominence that we give them, today, since they became what they became eventually, right? Like I don't
right. Yeah, I
like,
mean,
clearly they got to some scale when they got the state to pass a law against them to like X them out. So I'm not trying to take all their, I don't want to say credit, but I don't want to diminish it too much. But I'm just saying they really just caught a baton in the middle of the 4x4, and they were like the second one in it or something like that. Like
yeah,
they weren't the final run or anything, right? Like they
no, no. I mean, like again, the constitutional Klan is 1867, and then they are sort of crushed in 1871. So incredibly short period, incredibly short period of time that they're in operation. And as I mentioned, the Force Acts virtually end all Klan activity in South Carolina. So while they are crushing it everywhere, South Carolina, there's no Klan. So it's also interesting that Ben Tillman and the Red Shirts come out of South
Yeah,
Carolina.
yeah. Similar to how you were saying that Tennessee was one of the only states that ratified to become part of the Union.
Yeah.
And, so why weren't these Force Acts able to deal with, and I guess this kind of gets to this question of this 1877 compromise, but why weren't these Force Acts able to deal with these other entities like in the way they were able to deal with the Klan? Like why couldn't
Oh,
they crush the red shirts like they could crush the Klan or something else?
yeah. Unfortunately, Grant didn't want to go for a third term. Back then, the, you know, presidency could go for multiple terms. They were trying to talk him into going, staying on for a third term. He didn't want to go for a third term. And then that led to, what we now know of as the Compromise of 1877, where it was, a contentious that's kind of a weak expression of it, election, very slim results that, are still debatable in the present day. But besides that sort of compromise that leads to Rutherford B. Hayes becoming president
Hmm.
and Rutherford B. Hayes kind of bringing back Andrew Johnson-like presidency of looking way or leniency of, these particular sort of groups. He also removes the military occupation of the districts, so the districts are sort of ended completely. Yeah, yeah, no. So Rutherford B. Hayes, ends the occupation of the South. But before Rutherford B. Hayes, completes that, Grant does it because since he's not going to run for a third office, he's still very much trying to support his political party, and trying to get the next person elected. And he knows that, in particular, if Mississippi continues to be under occupation, it could fall the other way. Unfortunately, it was a bad judgment call, and fell the opposite way. It fell further, in the direction of red shirts and white nationalism and everything else. And that resulted in, Ohio also flipping, as well.
If Grant runs, do you think Reconstruction is actually able to finish his job if he would have just held
another term, or do you think this was inevitable at some point, even if it hadn't been 77, it would have been, I don't know, 84? Like, how do you think? Because I know we've talked a bit about like Wilmington and how, if that would have went through, if that hadn't been cut off, we might be in a different country. Do you think you could say similarly
Mm.
about Grant? Again, this is not for listeners, this is not to make Grant a messiah, but we're just talking about the political direction of where things might have went, because clearly there was a breakdown after that. Um,
Yeah. Um, I mean, based upon what we know of with his, biography, his own writings, he did hold a position of favorability to black people. I mean, which is, ironic, especially with his family background. That's, at a very young age, he went counter to the direction of his family. So yeah, it's quite possible, but I think it's not possible in the way that I think some listeners may think. So most of what we think of in terms of the Freedmen's, period, the Freedmen's Bureau is all about like banks, and property ownership and 40 acres of a
yeah, yeah,
mule.
yeah.
I'm more so saying, so I'm not sure how much the federal government, would have been able to finance, these programs, because that was also one of the things that was happening, was that the United States was becoming more and more bankrupt. So they couldn't afford to also maintain some of these programs. But so I'm not sure about that, but it's clear that he probably would have maintained the the occupation of those states. The reason why they were occupied as well wasn't just because they had succeeded, is that they had yet to do their own respective state constitutions to be in line with the federal constitution, and then to accept the 14th Amendment, which is why Tennessee wasn't occupied, because they did that outright. They knew what was coming. So whenever these other places were going to do that, they would have then finally been let go and could rejoin the United States. And so, Grant would have likely maintained occupation until they did what they were supposed to do. So if they did that, then voting rights would be very different. So instead of people losing voting rights all during this period, and then ultimately once Atlanta falls in 1906, black people barely can't vote until 1970s, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
1960s, you know, it would have been, a situation in which, yeah, still poverty, but black people could still run for office and still vote. And so that means they would still have representation, through, the electoral process during this time period, as opposed to decades of no electoral representation.
Right.
Again, I'm not, I don't think either one of us is saying that this would have meant like
Well,
incredible world, but it would have
yeah,
been,
yeah,
but it would have been at least like maybe no Jim Crow, just discrimination, just regular old like discrimination. Like so. If we can imagine a world where there's no lynching and no Jim Crow, just discrimination for several decades,
yeah. Like
like
it still wouldn't have been a time you want to go back to, but
no, 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 but
like again,
no, but
like we're not, like you said, we're not romanticizing it. Interesting to think about.
I know we're trying to think about, in terms of closing out, thinking about connecting, you know, this wave to, what's the connective thread to,
Right.
what happens. And of course, we'll get into it, in terms of the 1915, movie, The Birth of a Nation, but that's the thread. But it's not the movie, it's the book, The Klansman. The full title of The Klansman is The Klansman, A Historical Romance of the Ku Klux Klan by Thomas Dixon. And it's published in 1905. Remember, I just said 1906, Atlanta race riot, right? So he publishes this book in 1905, and it's a three-part, like, love story to the Klan. So the first book in the trilogy is called The Leopard Spot, Leopard Spots, a romance of the white man's burden from 1865 to 1900, and it's published in 1902. And it's a response to Harriet Beecher Stowe's, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So even though we hate the notion of Uncle Tom's Cabin, technically Uncle Tom's Cabin for the time period, influenced a lot of white people to think more favorably about black people. I know it's hard for us to think of that and understanding the things that are in it and the notion of Uncle Tom and all that type of stuff. But so he's writing a response, a retort to this, saying like, you cannot let up on controlling this beast, the black race. So that's the first book. Then the second book is The Clansman. And then the third book is called The Traitor, a story of the fall of the Invisible Empire in 1907. And that story is basically about, the fight against the good Klan and the bad Klan. And if you read it, the good Klan is technically the first Klan, and the bad Klan is this other Klan, this second Klan that emerges, with which ironically becomes a part of, Thomas Dixon's book is then, turned into a play, a stage production, first typically on university college campuses. University of Illinois is a first record that I have noticed that the Klan was performed at, and then Indiana University. And it was done and brought to the campus by student organizations, and the Klan becomes a student organization in certain cases, especially at University of Illinois. In 1906, 1908, they expand, and so the Klansman, the book, converts into the inspiration for D.W. Griffith's book interpretation or adaptation of the book, calling it The Birth of a Nation. And of course, retroactively, Thomas Dixon changes the name of the book, The Clansman, into A Birth of a Nation. But that's the connecting thread that, I could sort of think about, much less the vigilante activity that's happening by other groups, that are still active.
Right. Yeah, and I mean we didn't talk about it too much, but the propaganda element is vital, and we'll see that more, I think, in the second wave, because the second wave is somewhat sparked by propaganda, right? It's sparked by a film.
That's right. Yeah.
Propaganda in this era that we just covered was, it mattered, but like I said, that book got too much into the psychology for me, but
Yeah, and I guess maybe, just also to close out about the psychology thing. I think, as we alluded to, and I think you opened up with, saying, some points to that is that, what about the history? Like the analysis of history is important because we don't know what's on these people's minds, and so the ways in which people are psychoanalyzing, these people that aren't in front of you with no evidence but your opinion because you think their idea is lower than yours, as opposed to taking them seriously in terms of their activity. People don't engage in this level of violence out of insecurity. Like internal personal insecurity. They want power, they want property, they want control over territory and their life.
and that's what they're telling you. So,
Believe them.
we can prove that versus there's this being some kind of compensation for whatever. I don't really know, like that kind of stuff. You're getting into a weird space. And again, maybe it's true. I don't know. But what they're telling you and what they're doing is, like you said, they want property, they want power, and they wrote those things down. So we have to take them at their word to some extent, like, yeah, I think the psychoanalyzing thing is just part of, I think, how all of this stuff gets flattened, because when when you try to get in the head, and then white supremacy becomes some kind of mental illness, and then it's about like you try to white folks want to dominate black people for some like weird thing that folks come up with. Like it's not really, again, it's not even that maybe these things aren't true if we could get in people's heads and like somehow extract what's in their head, but we can't do that, especially 150, 200 years ago.
Right.
So You know,
And that's not how analysis works. Like, you have to have a study,
yeah,
you have to have a control group and all these types of things. And even when you do a good, well-designed study, it it doesn't speak to, it doesn't translate as an answer to an entire society. It just tells you about what maybe this group of people can, you can name something from their thought processes, their cognitive sort of functions and so forth. But just because that group of people in your study is acting in that way doesn't mean that that is a clear indicator of what other people are capable of doing or what other people are doing. And so, yeah, but what we do have evidence of are the diaries, the constitutions, and the body count.
if we're gonna do psychology, one thing that psychology does prove, most people don't self-conceive as being the villain. You know, that's one thing psychology does teach us. So, if you think that this is just some villainous thing from the perspective of them, no, they actually, like we said, they thought they were defending the South. We obviously don't agree or whatever, but they thought they were defending a certain position in life. They consider themselves as oppressed, as people who were occupied, as heroes. Like that's how they conceive of themselves. You know, so this whole like attempt to try to get white people to admit finally that they're villains, that's not gonna happen. It's like that's just not how it works,
And with this time period, they were occupied. Like,
Yeah,
it's not, it's not a thing that,
it's
in
not
some case,
delusional.
right, exactly.
Yeah,
It's just that, maybe, the frustration or as a result of it, you know, was exploited by, organized groups or whatever else, but there was an occupation, for quite some time that was brutal. There was, laws that could allow somebody to be killed because they had membership before, they, retired or they were suspected to. And so that could definitely, formulate ways in which people would, come together and create multiple organizations, engage in, defensive actions, and so forth. Yeah,
yeah.
it's not, yeah,
It
it's,
also just speaks to not the psychology part, but just I just recently wrote a paper about some of this, but like you know, we have these generic things. So we hear occupation is just immediately bad, even if it was for the reasons that were stated, or if a group of people are oppressed or in a certain kind of way, or not even a certain kind of way. When we hear these words, these are kind of buzzwords, and we don't really analyze the conditions themselves. So obviously nobody would openly, well, I don't say nobody. Most people wouldn't openly say that they were on the side of the South in this era, you know.
mhm, mhm,
But there wasn't going to be another way to deal with that kind of element, you know. Like you weren't going to deal with that through like a non-violent approach, just quite frankly. Like there was no way to deal with like your country had just broken into two, you were fought a war. I don't see there being another way to deal with that,
mhm.
you know. So I mean, like so in all cases, I'm not here trying to say occupation is a good thing. Obviously, most cases it's not, almost most of the time. But I'm just saying this was in defense of a people to some extent, not entirely. I'm not. The Republicans were racist at times too. Frederick Douglass was very open about this, but I'm saying this was in defense of a different kind of project that was a bit more inclusive than
Right,
the Confederacy was.
right.
So so sometimes when people say authoritarian and throw these words around, sometimes power has to be seized like that to bring about a different end. And Americans struggle with that concept, even though it's the most imperialist country. They struggle with that sometimes power has to be exerted, and everything can't be talked out and all of that. And I'll leave it there. But yeah. Um, So yeah, that's I don't know how long this went. I probably cut down my part ranting about the Reconstruction era to get it to time. Um, but but
Time.
but but yeah, that was a good first episode. We'll be back for two. We'll probably bring in some of the other castmates for maybe the second or third, just to mix up the perspectives a little bit. Um, but yeah, but thanks for breaking that down for us.
No doubt.
All right, peace out, y'all.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.